What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Behind the Door Podcast. I'm Brandon Brown with my good friend, the slim and sexy Jim. And we want to give a big shout out and thank you to our friend Kate for joining us today. And we're going to get into some issues and talk about Kate's experience and talk about some specific issues with women and reentry and support and incarceration. And Kate, just want to say thank you for being here with us today. Super excited to have you. And just start off by saying, tell everybody who's listening a little bit about yourself and what brings you here to Behind the Door today.
Yeah, so my name is Kate. I am from Maine. I served my prison sentence in the state of Wyoming at the Wyoming's Women's Center. So my story may be a little bit more unique or different than the woman who had, their incarceration here in the state of Maine. I guess you want me to start from the beginning? How does this work, guys?
Yeah, I mean, first, so awesome to introduce and say that, you've got experience with incarceration, and we love that not that you were incarcerated in Wyoming. Obviously, we hate to see anybody incarcerated, but to get that perspective is huge. But let's pause that part of the story and flash forward to what you're doing now and tell people who are listening a little bit about the work that you're doing now and how you kind of connected with us through that work.
Sure. So I'm currently the program outreach coordinator for Sophia's house. We are a low barrier housing program for women here in Lewiston, Maine. We serve women who are survivors of trauma, specifically domestic violence, trafficking, exploitation, as well as women reentering after incarceration and substance use.
It's a beautiful thing. I mean, another story of somebody who's been through a lot, experienced incarceration and reentry, gone through your own barriers, but made the leap into, living a life of service and provided those opportunities for other people to not have to go through what you went through in your reentry, which we'll get into. But I think that's a huge way to start this episode, right? To talk about one thing we always try to do on Behind the Door is reframe for people what people who have experienced incarceration are capable of doing with their lives. And so, I'm just going to give you another thank you for coming to share your story and getting into some of it with us. But more importantly, thank you for doing the work that you're doing out here to make our communities a better place, despite your incarceration and the difficulties that you've had in your life. And, shout out to RCOM as always for doing the same thing. And it's beautiful to be in a room with people who, care enough about other folks struggling to lift them up. So thank you for the work that you do first and foremost. Jeremy, how did we meet Kate? Let's give a little bit about that.
Well, Kate, I think is probably our biggest fan. I see, social media. She likes our stuff. She shows up. I think she was the first one that I actually saw wear one of our T-shirts in public. I think I was like, oh shit, that's one of our T-shirts, man. Like awesome, man. But I think we had a chance to speak at an event we had. And Kate showed some interest in coming on, and I was like, man, that sounds great, man. It's like, anytime we can get another voice, another story, another perspective on this thing, and especially somebody who's obviously as passionate about this thing as we are, I think, Yeah.
I want to say too, like, for anybody who's maybe listening for the first time or tuning in and doesn't have a lot of background context, I'm interested to hear from you, Kate. Like, what was it about the podcast that kind of drew you in? Like, what stood out for you?
So it actually, my interest started before, listening to the podcast. So I actually became interested in restorative justice about a year ago. I was taking classes at Central Maine Community College, nonprofit courses, and I interviewed a gentleman named Bruce King, and he was telling me about Maine Inside Out. And that's really what piqued my interest, just about, restorative justice, prison reform, and what that really looks like. I am an alumni of Long Creek Youth Development Center myself. So I thought the work that they were doing inside the youth facilities was amazing. Just from there, things kind of snowballed for me. I did a lot of personal research. And then I just started following other influencers, and I, listening to podcasts like Ear Hustle, which is a restorative justice podcast. And then and I started following Jessica Kent. And I found her really amazing because she used to sell magazines for the same company that I used to sell magazines for. So I immediately had like this connection with her because we had that shared experience. But then also because she's done something with her life and is giving back through using her prison experience. So I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And real quick, I just want to do a shout out to Jessica Kent and Matt and my Double O family. If you're out there listening, please connect us. So everything just kind of snowballed. And then I was talking to Randy Beard, and he was telling me about the podcast, and I was hooked after the first episode. And I was like, how can I get involved? What can I do? I reached out to you, through social media because like I said, I wanted to get involved. And now I'm just learning, this is my new favorite phase is it's when opportunity and preparation meet. And that's where I'm at today.
That's the definition of luck, right? Opportunity, meeting, preparation. My dad's been saying that my whole life. So shout out to you, Mark Brown, for telling me that all luck is preparation, meeting, opportunity. But I think, just to jump on what you're saying too, like number one, big shout out to anybody who's doing this and using their story of their struggle to uplift other people. And one thing that Jerry and I knew coming into this is, that there is a fair amount of people who are telling their story, as hard as it is, to kind of reframe for people what prison is, what reentry is, and who the people behind these doors are. And that really for us was kind of a catalyst, right? Understanding that we have the door and that what we need to do is tell real stories of the real people behind it. And so just, again, very grateful for you to come here. And what I didn't know about your story is that you're an alum of Long Creek. And that's a really, really interesting thing to learn because we're actually also doing, a series on juvenile justice issues and why youth incarceration is not the way to fix any social problems. And so I just kind of toss it back to you, Kate, and start us from the beginning. What brought you to Long Creek and kind of where did your life go from there that, ultimately ended up in you doing some time in Wyoming and then coming back here all these years later to do the amazing work you're doing now. Just give us kind of a preview of what your life's been like.
Sure. So like I previously said, I'm from Maine. I grew up with divorced parents. I also grew up in an alcoholic and addicted family. Dad's side of the family lived in Portland. They divorced. Mom got a house in Lisbon. So I went back and forth between homes. I kind of fell into the lifestyle that was being modeled around me. And I didn't know or didn't realize at the time that, my father was an alcoholic. It's not something that we talked about. We all knew it was there, or what was going on. But like I said, it was very hush hush. And I didn't realize and I started using and drinking at a really young age myself. Once again, it's just kind of what was acceptable in my home. But I was, an addict after the first hit. I was an alcoholic after the first drink. I always had to go above and beyond. And I really tried to portray myself as a really hardened individual because I thought that was cool. And I just, I delved right into living a criminal lifestyle, trying to outdo everyone. By the time I was 15, I had a criminal record. All of my, I have a really, really lengthy criminal record, and all of my charges and convictions are based off of me being in a blackout. They're all alcohol or drug related. And at 15, I was placed on drug court, which I was really not a good candidate for because I couldn't stop. Especially being in a home that was actively using as a child, I could not stay sober. I lacked, role models. So yeah, I did the drug court thing on and off for a couple of years. I can tell you from the ages of 16 to 26, I was either incarcerated in treatment or on the run. And yeah, so that's really how I ended up in Long Creek is, just being sanctioned. I would spend every weekend in Long Creek because I wouldn't stop smoking weed. And eventually I ran and I got caught and I was held until my 18th birthday. And when I was released, I went back to the same thing because that's all I knew. That was all that was around me.
What was that experience like for you in the time that you spent in Long Creek? I mean, in the weekends, and then ultimately when you actually got committed, how did that experience of youth incarceration kind of shape the prospects for your future that ultimately led to adult incarceration?
I think it made incarceration acceptable and comfortable for me. I knew it was, hot meals, a bed. I knew I was safe there. So, I have experienced a lot of trauma in my life, and you know, it wasn't, I think like I said, I felt safe there. I was comfortable there. I knew everyone. I knew the staff.
So it almost like normalized incarceration. And this is something that Jeremy, you've talked about, I mean, just between us off of the podcast, we talk about this all the time, but you've talked about it on episodes too. What is your take on that? You heard Kate say that like it became normal and like not even something that was bothersome to go back to jail as a young person and then ultimately as an adult. And why is that such a problem for us as a society when we normalize incarceration for our youth?
Well, I think it comes down to the perspective of society itself, right? Like, because I've been in a situation where I was the kid in the neighborhood that the parents didn't want the other kids to hang around with. You know what I'm saying? And then, like, I feel like I relate to what Kate was saying a lot when she said, I wanted to be this, right? Like, I took this on, this identity. I take this identity on, and then once we start going into the system, we end up being around kids that have done this, that feel the same way. You know what I mean? Like they just got there a different way, and then we end up trying to fit into that, and then that's what becomes normal. And I think the safety aspect of it too, it's like if I'm worried about what's going on at home, at least in the institution, I can kind of control what's going on, right? Like I have my reputation to fall back on, right? But at home, I ain't got, you know what I mean? Like I'm just a kid, you know what I mean? I'm a victim in a home, right? But in the institution, I don't have to be a victim anymore. I can set my own reputation almost. You know what I mean?
Man, it's like a really scary thing almost to hear somebody say that as a young person incarcerated, it was the place that I felt safe. And it's scary to me because like what we hear from like the Department of Corrections and what we hear from law enforcement and from a lot of like system stakeholders is that we have to provide a safe place for young people when they don't have it. And then we create this like we imagine that safe place is the prison, and we call it everything we want to call it. We call it.
I think the safety is like an acute safety. They look at it like I'm going to keep this kid safe today. Like he's not gonna, you know what I mean, hurt himself or like that. And it's just for right now, right? But it's not really about like how am I going to keep a kid safe
long term,
6 months after they get out.
And I think that's the part that we have to name. That when I hear from your story, Kate, to hear you say like those words the way you said them, like they really hit me for a second because that is the language that the system is using to justify itself in a lot of ways. But what you're talking about is how that safety also normalized incarceration for you and made it like not a problem. Like, okay, I'm going to go back to Long Creek, or I'm going to go to jail, or I'm going to go to prison because I feel safe there. And that's the part where I think we have to talk about how that's not a good response when we institutionalize safety for kids inside of a prison.
Well, I just want to say this too. It's like what I can relate to is being a young boy.
Yeah.
Right. And I think being a young woman, and you know what I mean? Like I think it's looked like society and the way programming, all this stuff is set up looks differently at males than it does females that are coming out. You know what I mean? Do you feel like there's a difference for you being a female and like how you were looked at that way?
Well, in terms of safety, I know for me, I really didn't spend a lot of time at home once I kind of got going like within my addiction. So I was out on the streets. So,
so that was putting you at higher risk.
Exactly. So like, at the time too, like Long Creek wasn't really a consequence to me, like I said, it was a warm, safe place. I'm not out on the street. I'm getting fed. I don't have to worry about being harmed by someone else. So that's really, in terms of safety, how I looked at it. or I look at it. And also it provided structure, which isn't something I ever had in my home. And I think, as a child, you crave that structure without, like, subconsciously, without realizing it. And it provided that.
And it's interesting because when we provide those things, but also hearing you say, like, you would be there for a weekend and get out and go back and experience that safety and snippets almost, and then get out. It wasn't preparing you to, like, have a safe environment to re-enter to, or it wasn't surrounding you with the tools that you needed to experience that safety outside of that setting, to where coming back to it wasn't so normal, and almost something that, like, okay, it's a break from the chaos, but it's the same chaos you're returning to every time.
Right. And, I think about this and, looking back in retrospect and, like, being on drug court and, like, having the home visits and going to residential treatment centers, as a teenager. How did no one ever see the red flags? How did no one ever see what the hell was going on with me or my family? And don't get me wrong, I do have great parents. Well, my dad has passed, but, like, I had great parents. They were struggling with their own issues. And I have great relationships, with everyone in my family today. But I just don't understand either how, these people of authority or whoever, the probation officers, the counselors, the teachers at school, how come nobody ever spoke up? How come no one ever had a conversation with me or with my parents about, like, my behavior or grades or whatever the case may be?
And what I see too is part of the problem is, I'm just thinking about these, like, competing and contradicting narratives where you as a young person felt safe inside because it was a warm place and a safe place where you didn't have to worry about somebody, hurting you and all of the, risk that you are taking living that lifestyle. But the ironic part is that people in society, once you touch like a youth facility, are viewing you as, like, the unsafe kid, right? So it's like this contradiction where, to you, finding safety in that system was also the thing that was keeping society from thinking that you were a safe young person. And so, like, all of this contradiction that you're existing with, transitioning out every time, coming out with all the anxiety and all the risk of being in the streets again, but also coming out to a community that looks at you like you're a bad kid. You were locked up. Like, I don't want to be around you. I don't want my kids around you. And Jeremy even said that you were that young person at one point. And I think that those narratives and stigmas we assign to young people who experience incarceration are a big part of why it's so difficult to break those cycles and why young people keep finding safety and structure inside of the institution. And once that's normalized, how do you break that cycle? And I'm interested for you, moving away from your experience with youth incarceration into what led up to you doing a few years in Wyoming. What was that trajectory like? It's the worst word ever, but, like, graduating from the youth system to the adult.
I want to find out how you got out to Wyoming.
So yeah, after I was released on my 18th birthday, it only took a couple of months before I was out committing crime again. And I was
You
placed.
said committed crime. Were you, like, robbing banks?
No,
Kind of crime down there. What were you into anyway?
I don't remember what my charges were as a juvenile. I think it was just, like, petty stuff, breaking windows, getting into fights, And then as an adult, when I turned 18, I was in a blackout and I burglarized some vehicles. I stole a couple cars. My face was on the front page of the Sun Journal. Yeah, nice. Yeah. Yeah. I woke up. Yeah, I'm not gonna get too deep into it, but yeah, and I got caught, and I don't remember specifically. I think, like I said, they put me on a deferred deposition. I don't believe it was a felon. I wasn't charged with any felonies because they never. It was always like it was less than a year, so all my time would have been done in the county. So, I'm a runner. I've always ran, so that's what I did. And at that time, I chose to hide in Portland rather than in Lewiston, where I was known. And one day, this kid comes up to me down at Preble Street, and he hands me a 1-800 number, and he's like, "Hey, I just met these people. do you want to travel the country for free and sell some magazines? And I was like, heck yes. I'm like, I'm on the run. They're never going to catch me, you know? And that's what I did. And my boss at the time, Matt, got me on got me a Greyhound bus ticket to New Jersey. And I did that on and off until I was 22. I don't want to bash the Androscoggin County Sheriff's Department, but here's a crazy story for you. I had served like a little bit of that, like less than a year or whatever, here at ACJ. And while I was on the run, I got caught in Texas, and they extradited me from Victoria, Texas to Maine to serve 4 months here in ACJ. And that amazed me that they would spend that much money on transporting somewhere. Yeah. It's correct. Yeah. I had a stable job for years. Well, I was doing decent, but I was still an alcoholic. At that time, drugs had been removed from my life, but I was still drinking on a daily basis. And I was, to be honest with you, I was still a hot mess. But to rewind, to go back to that, I had done my time here in the county, and I was released, and I called my boss wanting, asking for my job back. And, I went back out on the road, and I had always loved Wyoming. I've traveled the country 4 times. I've been to almost all 50 states. I really loved Wyoming, and, I actually ended up what's called crew hopping. I went from one crew to the next, which is frowned upon in the magazine world. And I was in California, and it's a really dangerous job, and I experienced that. So I am a survivor of an attempted murder. I was in 29 Palms, California. I knocked on someone's door. I thought I was safe, and I was not. And long story short, he went to prison for a good amount of time, and I survived, right? And after that, things got a little crazy for me, like mentally, emotionally. I didn't really take care of myself. I, turned to drugs as a coping mechanism, and I ended up in Wyoming. And I had a boyfriend at the time, and I settled there for maybe about a year. And I was selling drugs to support my habit, and because that's all I, knew outside of the magazine world as an adult. And I got caught. Yeah. And that's pretty much how I ended up in
doing some prison time in Wyoming. Here's a really important question for you. We've only been able to do one episode so far to explore uniquely the unique issues that women face with incarceration and reentry and recovery. And you just said something that I think people really need to hear more about and hear it unpacked a little bit, which is that a lot of people don't understand that women in prison in our country, the majority of women in prison in our country are survivors of physical, domestic, and sexual violence. And that a good majority of the women who have experienced that and done exactly what you just narrated, which is turned to drugs as coping mechanisms and continued the cycle of toxic relationships and drug use and stuff. And then that ultimately catches up to them and can lead to incarceration. And I'm just wondering, from your experience, doing time in Wyoming, doing time as a young lady in Long Creek, and now in the job that you do assisting women in their recovery and reentry, how true is that to you? Is that something that you've noticed and experienced in your life experience, that a lot of the women that are encountering these systems are coming from some pretty traumatic pasts?
Yes. Yeah. In one form or another. Absolutely. And I also think that everyone's trauma looks a little bit different. What could be traumatizing for me might not have any skin off your back. Right. So I think that's always something to be aware of. But yeah, absolutely. And I also, I think that the addiction, the incarceration, it's all cycles that all co-occur together.
Yeah.
Not always, but more often
than not. Yeah. And what was, before we get into kind of what your experience in prison and reentry was like, what role, when you were going through, you got caught up selling drugs to support your habit and, ultimately received a prison sentence in Wyoming for that. When you were going through that process of getting caught, getting your charges, receiving a plea agreement, going to trial, whatever that looked like for you, how much care did the system offer you about what you've been through that may have led to the things that you were doing? Was that ever even a topic of conversation?
No, it was never even brought up. Yeah, it was never even brought up. And so I didn't even know that I had a warrant out for my arrest either. I had ended up leaving Wyoming and I was living in Idaho. I was placed on probation in the state of Idaho for an assault charge. And, a few months into my probation period, I had a knock on my door and they said, "Oh, you're getting extradited to Wyoming. You're wanted. You're a fugitive from justice, yada, yada." And so yeah, I didn't even know about the charge because it took them a year to indict me. And then, but yeah, no, my history was never brought up other than you're a criminal. Look at your rap sheet. You've been, getting into trouble your entire life. It was, nothing about my trauma or how I got to where I was at was ever a conversation.
I'm interested too, from your perspective, Jeremy, with the work that ARCOM's doing, and you guys are about to open up a women's house, but you've been doing this work for quite a few years, with men who have experienced, addiction and incarceration and these things. In your experience, how often have people said something similar to what Kate just said, where man, I've been through all this shit in my life, all this trauma, and it, led me to addiction and committing crimes. And, have you ever heard a story from somebody where they're like, I feel like the court really made space for me to talk about what I've been through that led to these things?
No, I mean, I think what Kate, I say this all the time, no one asked me either.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? No one asked me, hey, what was going on at home? You know what I mean? What's going on outside of here? How come you're acting? You know what I mean? That. It's for a long time in our society, we don't ask those questions. It's this person did this thing, then you're gonna get punished for it. You know what I mean? There is no mid. You know what I mean? It's black and white in a lot of ways. You know what I mean? You did this. You're talking about how did she got introduced to the Long Creek was through it's breaking into a car and doing all this stuff. It's that doesn't necessarily, it doesn't correlate. The punishment doesn't correlate for a teenage person, a kid, to be incarcerated for mischievous issues because I don't know what's going on at home. You know what I mean? That's how we respond. And I know for myself, I was in a situation where they wanted to give me medication and shit. Oh, he's hyper. He has ADHD. It was no, actually, I just seen my dad smack the shit out of my mom the night before. And I don't know how to I don't know what's going to happen when I get off the school bus today. You know what I mean? So I'm acting up, and then they suspend you from school. And then they fucking this, that, the other thing. And then next thing you know, it's why not break into a car to get fucking $20 to get some beers or something? You know what I mean? What's the point? What's the point? You know what I mean? Why not? You know what I mean? And then you're a criminal, right? I'd be labeled a criminal, and really, this reminds me that we don't necessarily treat addiction, we treat trauma, right? Kate is telling us that she comes from a long line of trauma, and that trauma didn't stop. Responding, her reactions to the trauma didn't stop from the time she was a child until, you know what I mean? It's just wow, shit. You know what I mean? The recovery process started to happen, you know what I mean?
And I think it's just important, to take a second to actually acknowledge something that you've kind of shined a light on for us in your experience, is that a healthy system that doesn't want crime to continue, that doesn't want people to cycle in and out and wants people to actually rehabilitate and find a way to be better, would be a system that actually addresses the things that you've been through in your life that have led to these things. And instead, we have a system that, okay, you commit a crime, we're going to label you a criminal and we're going to punish you. And then we're just going to hope that after all this punishment is over, that you're going to figure it out. But the fact that we don't actually talk about what did you go through that led you to this moment where you committed a crime, or what did you go through that led you to this moment where you became addicted to alcohol or drugs. We don't have a system that cares about that. For kids, for women who have experienced extreme amounts of trauma, for men who have experienced trauma, right? We have a society that just normalizes criminality and this idea that you're a bad person and that's why you've made these decisions. But in the reality, when we're hearing your story, what we're hearing is like, no, I went through some shit and I didn't really know how to process that shit as a young woman. And then I went through some shit as an adult woman and I didn't really know how to process that shit. And so, you know, what I saw growing up was substances being used to mask the pain. And so that's what I learned. And then it continued. And then all of a sudden now you're a criminal. And so what was that like for you to, you know, kind of be in and out of the system, end up in California, experience that trauma that you were able to survive, and then continue to cope? And then next thing you know, you're in a women's prison in Wyoming. And what was that experience like for you going through your incarceration once you were there?
Sure. So when I received my sentence, so I received a 3 to 5 year sentence. I had to serve a minimum 3 years, maximum 5 years. Whatever time in between there would be my parole period, which I'll get into that in a little bit. But so like I thought like my world was done. I'm like, my life is over. And it was really scary because, you know, when you think of prison, it's not county. It's not, you know, the youth center. People think, you know, like, orange is the new black. There's fights, there's drugs, there's this and that. And that's the complete opposite of what I found, you know, in the Wyoming's Women's Center. It's a really small facility. I think like 250 women out in like prairies in Wyoming. The only people in the town of Lusk is either railroad workers or, you know, whoever's being employed by the prison. I was also mandated to complete the intensive treatment unit, the ITU. If I chose not to complete that program, then I would have had to serve a flat 5 years with no possibility of parole, and that's a long time. So I went in there and you know, and I did it. And it's, from what I've heard of you and your experience, Jeremy, it's very similar to the is it CSR?
CRA.
Yeah, CRA.
It's a therapeutic community.
Same thing, therapeutic community. There's like 55 women in there at a time. But that really laid like my prison experience just in general laid a foundation for me in my recovery, how to live a stable life and to be an adult. And yeah, do you want to ask me any more questions from there?
No, what I am interested to know, so you went through that treatment program, which is obviously really beneficial for you because it gave you, like you're talking about as a young person, how structure was something you needed and that you found it and that feeling of safety in Long Creek. And so now you've gone to the women's prison and you've done that ITU program and, you know, kind of found that foundation for you on stability and like done some of that inner work to probably address some of your trauma. And then my question for you is then what happened?
So I was a little bitter when it came to my release because I had done everything that I could to not come back to the Lewiston, Auburn community. So I was released in 2016 and I received an interstate compact to come back to the state of Maine. I wanted to go to Wellsprings because I wanted to go to a halfway house. I wanted structure. I wanted to be in a sober environment. And I knew I wouldn't get that if I returned back to Lewiston. They kept pushing my date back, right? It's because at that time it was Wellsprings, or I believe it's called a Grace House or something like that. In Portland, those were the only like sober living houses for women at that time. So I was supposed to get into Wellsprings. So they said, yep, you know, we have this date for you. And then they said, nope, a woman came in, you know, who's pregnant, she takes precedence over you. We're going to push your date back. So when I had gone in front of the parole board, I had asked for what's called special good time, where they would give you an extra 30 days for each year off your bottom number. That's kind of confusing. So I got an extra 90 days. So by the time like I had completed like the ITU program, I was able to get out. I just didn't have a place to go. So the second time Wellsprings, had pushed my date back, I was just like, you know what, this isn't meant to be. I've been sitting here in prison for an extra 6 months just trying to get into this program. I can't wait any longer. So I was released and I went back to my mom's house. And at the time, I had maybe $100 in my pocket. I was working at the maintenance department, making about 25 cents an hour, which was one of the best jobs in the facility. Yeah, I had maybe $100, in my pocket from saving. And I did my best to try to get a phone mailed into me because I was traveling cross country on a Greyhound. And I was like, what the heck am I going to do? I'm in gray sweatpants that have my name tag and my prison number. They tried giving me the jean jacket because it was, I don't know, I got released March 31st of 2016. It was cold, I said, I don't want that jacket. I said, she was like, you can keep that. And they loaded a few of us up. I think there's maybe 5 of us in a van, and they dropped us off at a gas station in the middle of nowhere and just waited for the Greyhound. So that was what my day of release looked like. Traveled on a Greyhound for 3 days to come back to Lewiston, and had the best welcome. My brother and his girlfriend and my family were outside of the Greyhound station right down the road with these big signs, holding up signs saying, "Welcome home, Kate." I felt very loved that day. Yeah.
But it's an interesting dichotomy though, right? Because one of the things that I'm struggling with, and we hear this story so much from people that we talk to, is you did everything right while you're in, right? You went through the steps, you found yourself in a really tough situation. You said yourself that you thought your life was over when you got that 3 to 5. You got mandated to do the ITU program in order to get those 2 years off of your sentence, which of course any sane person is going to do that, right? And you do all this work and you really start healing and transforming. And then you get in a situation where you're making the decision that I need sober living and I need low barrier access to sober living, and you end up sitting in prison for 6 extra months while you're waiting for that sober living. And then you have to make basically that decision to say, I'm just sitting in a prison waiting, and of course you don't want to be there. And then you get dropped off at a gas station in the middle of nowhere with $100 in your pocket. And I think the irony that I want to point out is that the system wanted so much from you. It wanted you to do this program and take this program serious, and it wanted you to do your work, and then it didn't set you up for success in any type of way to re-enter you into society. It put you on a Greyhound bus with prison clothes and $100, and thank God you had that welcome to come home to. And so I think it's, I don't know. I'm kind of struggling. I'm interested in what either of you think about that expectation that society expects all this from you while you're in prison. Heal, grow, transform, and then it lets you out to nothing. Yeah. How did you reconcile with that?
I think I was just hungry to be out, right? I just wanted to live my life. I was ready. That the incarceration chapter of my life was over. So I didn't really hang on to any resentment or anything. What was really challenging for me was being on that Greyhound for those 3 days after being incarcerated for 3 years. That was such a shock because I had been around the same woman, for so long, and to be out in a public space, it caused me a lot of anxiety. And not to mention, too, I have a lot of history being on Greyhound buses, so it was, reminded me a lot of my past and going cross country, doing the magazine thing and, and whatever reckless behaviors I had, I was displaying at that time and not falling back into that, and, being in Port Authority, New York, I have a history of that too. And I'm not going to get into this long story, but there was a period of time where I spent, my time in New York City. So being in New York for 6 hours, I was like, oh shit, I know I have the world at my fingertips if I just step out on Broadway. and just really not falling back into those old behaviors and really just keeping my eye on the prize of getting home and doing the right thing.
What do you think the most unique thing for you and for women coming home, like what aspect of reentry do you think is really unique for women in your experience as compared to like maybe the experience of men?
I'm really unsure. I don't really know how to answer that, because I know for me, like, I was a young single woman. Like, I didn't have children, so I didn't have like a family. For me, it was the beginning of my journey of learning how to be a stable, independent human being and how to be responsible, find a job, maintain a job, how to stay sober. So that's really where my mind was at, when I was released. I can tell you my biggest challenge was finding employment. I couldn't find employment for the life of me, because I had to share, like, right? Like, I was just in prison last week, I am not that person. This is who I am today, and this is what I've done, to become this new Kate. Nobody really wanted to hear it. Nobody wanted to take a chance on me. But I finally got my break at Da Vinci's Eatery. A friend of mine was one of the managers, and the general manager interviewed me. Didn't want to hire me because I was a felon. And my girlfriend talked to the owner, and he took that chance on me. And it was worth it. I was there, from 2016 till we shut down in COVID, and I went from working as a hostess to becoming a manager myself. So I really I took that time, and I was thriving, right? I was hungry.
Big shout out to Da Vinci's. Let's take a pause there for not only making delicious Italian food in Lewiston, Maine, but also for giving people chances, like our good friend Kate. Keep those garlic knots coming, by the way, too. So I think, I think maybe the next thing that would be really important for people to hear is, Jeremy's talked a lot on here about his transition from, making that change, going through the CRA program, and, getting that security and that stability that you're talking about through work and finding a community and everything, to then establishing Recovery Connections of Maine and really doing this work that's like lifting people up. And one thing we're always talking about on the podcast is like, community is everything. Your network is everything. Having people show up that give you chances to not only fall, but to get back up is everything. And, tell people that are listening a little bit about the work that you guys are doing, lift up that work and why you think it's so important as the program outreach coordinator. Did I get that right? Legend.
So I'm super passionate about our program, because if I had that available to me in 2016 when I was released, I would have jumped on that opportunity, because the program is exactly what I was looking for as a young woman, in recovery, with my history or whatnot. But so yeah, I'm actually pretty new in my role. I started in September, so I've only been there for a few months. And I just, like I said, I love the work that we do. I think that we give the woman a lot of freedom, but we also provide that structure, and we offer individualized phase work for each resident, because everyone's on their own recovery journey, right? And we do have somewhat of a broad community of women that we work with, so it looks, everybody, like I said, everyone's phase work looks a little bit different. Some of the work that I'm really excited about doing is going into the reentry center, sharing information about our program, and kind of, spreading my wings that way too. Yeah.
And then Jeremy, for you, Recovery Connections of Maine has been around for a minute doing this work, really high level work, with people, with their addictions and their trauma, and then also reintegrating, men back into the community post incarceration. But you guys are on the verge of opening the Women's House, and why is that specific work important to you under the umbrella of the Recovery Connections of Maine? Like, why are you guys making that leap?
Well, it's always been part of our plan. We started with the men because I think that's what we were, good at. But there's not enough services for women, really. That's really, there's a gap in our community. There's a gap in in the way women are, recovery services are handled for women, for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting when I think about your story, and I think about the way that stories work in society and the way that people are always judged for what they've done, and how people, what they've been through is received. Man, Kate, I'm thinking about your story. Like, if you just sat down with anybody in this world, I feel like, and you told them the story of you being a survivor, and you left out everything else, and you left out everything you went through as a young person and everything you went through post-survivor with that incident, and you just told them the story about what you went through, how people would sit there and they would really empathize with you, and they would feel like nobody should go through that, and you would get that response. But then I think about how our society works with, like, when we think about crime and addiction, and how everything in that story and in your collective story that you've been through is minimized by this concept of like crime and criminality and addiction. And, as we kind of like wrap this episode up, I'm wondering, what is it that you would say to anybody who, what advice would you give to somebody in society who encounters somebody who's been through what you've been through, about just like listening and showing up for them, and how important that is for them on their journey, despite like you've been through some really tough shit, and your reaction to that was not something that you necessarily chose, right? It was just what you knew and what you went to. And so just what would you tell somebody who's listening and wondering, how to make that connection, that it's okay?
In a previous podcast, you've always asked people, like, if there was a time in their life where they felt like a human, or somebody who has made that impact, or that positive impact, or something along those lines. But so my advice would be something that my caseworker told me at the Wyoming Women's Center. Is my first time meeting with her, and she said, the only difference between me and you is that you got caught. So the moral behind that is that, we all have skeletons in our closets. We all make mistakes, and it's important not to judge people, because we're not our mistakes, right? And I believe that it's possible that anybody can change, because I'm an example of that. And for anybody out there who is still struggling, just don't give up. Keep showing up. Don't be afraid to reach out, ask for help, even if you're awkward. Like, I know when I came up to Jeremy after the event, I felt super awkward, and I was talking so fast because I was so nervous, but I wanted to be known, right?
It's funny because I was awkward. I was hiding in the back. I was like overloaded, and then I was like, oh shit, there comes somebody coming to talk to me. I was like, oh shit.
And now I feel like I'm just like a little like buzz, like a fly in everyone's ear, because when I see people out in community, Brandon, Jeremy, the Nicola Mays, the Bruce Kings, I put my name out there. I talk to them. I introduce myself, and eventually things will fall in place when the time is right,
Absolutely. And then Jeremy, I think kind of the same question that, you've said a bunch of times on here, that like we only have one chance. As long as we're breathing and our heart is beating, that's the chance. And as long as that's true, we should continue to give people platforms to make changes and do better. And I think when we talk about these like specific issues to women, and the unique aspects of women's incarceration and reentry, what's something that today, after hearing Kate's story, that you want people who are listening to know about, like making that space for people to be their whole selves with their failures and their successes and everything?
Can you say that again?
What after this episode, like everything we've talked about with Kate and her sharing, what's something that you just feel is resonating with you that you just want to tell people? What's a message you want to leave people with today?
Well, I think Kate is, as different as our stories are, like, different, how people got to where they were incarcerated, the recovery journey, how different they are. The feelings are the same, right? Like the experience of it, like becomes. I can relate to Kate when she's, but we come from different places, you know what I mean? We come from completely different places, right?
Yeah.
But like at the same time, like I can connect to her story, you know what I mean? And so when we can do that for each other, that's when like we start to heal up a little bit, you know what I mean? That's when we can use our stories and stuff and So some of the stuff that Kate was talking about, I was just that's we're not as unique sometimes as we think we are. You know what I mean? Like we're all like kind of dealing with this on a human experience level.
No, I think you couldn't be more right about that. And I just wanted to take time to say thanks again to you, Kate, for coming and like being vulnerable and sharing your story with us and letting people hear your story, because there's so much to learn from it. And I think that one of the things that Jerry brought up is really important. It's like a key takeaway for us to think about is like you started off by saying you didn't do your time in Maine, so your story is going to be a little bit more unique than maybe other people we've had on the podcast. But I think one of our big goals of the podcast is to like do away with this idea of what's unique and adopt more of the idea of how universal a lot of this is, right? Like we've never talked to somebody on this podcast or in our professional lives or our personal lives who experienced incarceration who didn't have some trauma, right? We haven't talked to people who have experienced addiction who didn't have some things that they were struggling to deal with and didn't have an outlet to deal with them and didn't have the community and the connection. And so even though all of our stories individually have those unique components, our story collectively has a universal component to it. And I think one of the beautiful things that you've been able to share with us today is, despite your experiences with everything you've been through from Maine to California to Wyoming to Idaho to Texas, there are these underlying root causes that society doesn't really give us the space to heal from before they throw us into a cage and expect us to figure it all out. And a lot of times people ask, like, if we don't do prison, what do we do, right? If we end youth incarceration, what do we do? And I think what you've kind of shown us today on this episode is that maybe the first thing we need to do is actually show up for people and care for them about what they've been through. And then once we do that, we give them the outlet to actually heal and find structure and trust and safety in society, that maybe prison doesn't need to be the answer for them. So you've got me thinking a lot, and I think we'll kind of keep exploring that in other episodes. But I just want to thank you, give you a big shout out for being here with us today and sharing your story. And thanks to all the listeners. And, follow us, download, subscribe, share it, keep on with the journey. And we look forward to another episode and having you back on, hopefully sooner rather than later. Thanks.